The desert wind moaned low across the dry plains, carrying with it the taste of dust, death, and secrets too heavy for ordinary men to bear, and it was under that merciless sun that we found ourselves chained, wrists rubbed raw against the coarse rope, the smell of sweat and fear mixing with the creak of leather saddles from the men who had captured us, their eyes sharp and suspicious, as though every movement we made whispered betrayal, and though we had not spoken the truth out loud, they somehow knew we carried knowledge that could tear their entire world apart. A deadly secret buried beneath the soil of the old frontier, a secret we had stumbled upon by accident, but one that was enough to sign our death warrant. And as they dragged us into the heart of Dust Creek, a town built on greed, whiskey, and silence, we felt the gaze of every townsfolk upon us, each face hardened like stone, some pitying, most indifferent, as though the noose was nothing new to them, just another morning's entertainment. But for us, the thought of death tightened around our throats before the rope ever could. We hadn't asked for this. We were just wanderers, drifting across the plains with nothing but our saddlebags in the hope of finding work or rest. And one evening, when the blood-red sunset painted the horizon, we stumbled upon the ranch at Black Hollow, a place that seemed quiet, abandoned even. But the silence there was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something being hidden, and the deeper we walked, the more the land seemed to groan under the weight of a buried truth. And it was there we saw them, men dressed in black coats, though the heat baked the earth, digging fast, shovels clanging against something not made of dirt but of iron, crates sealed with markings that didn't belong to ranchers or cowhands but to the kind of men who thrived on war, smuggling, and the kind of trade that could kill hundreds, maybe thousands. And when we realized what we were seeing, we knew our fate had already been sealed, because men like that didn't forgive witnesses. We tried to slip away, hearts pounding like stampeding hooves, but fate betrayed us. The snap of a branch beneath our boots gave us away, and in a blink, guns were pointed, voices shouting, and the next thing we knew, we were thrown face down in the dust, tied like cattle awaiting slaughter, and dragged to town with our captors whispering to each other about hanging us at first light, because to let us live meant to risk everything they'd built in shadows. And so now we stood at the gallows, the wooden frame looming like a skeleton against the sky, the crowd restless, children clinging to their mothers as if sensing the darkness about to unfold. And though our knees trembled, though the rope brushed against our skin as the hangman tested its strength, inside our chests something burned brighter than fear, a desperate will to survive, a defiance that whispered maybe this wasn't the end, maybe somewhere fate had hidden a hand to pull us from this grave. Sheriff's voice rang out, harsh and cold, declaring us guilty without trial, guilty without chance to speak, guilty of nothing more than knowing too much. And the irony of it all made bile rise in our throats, because the law we had trusted was nothing but a mask, a servant of the men who controlled this secret. And when the nooses tightened around our necks and the wooden floor beneath us groaned with our weight, I thought of the sky wide and endless, and wondered if freedom was only meant to be tasted in the last breath before death. But then, just as the hangman's hand reached for the lever, thunder rolled, though the sky was clear, and a voice roared across the square with a fury that silenced the restless crowd, a voice that carried the weight of justice, anger, and something deeper, a rancher's heart, unwilling to see men die for truth. It was Eli McGraw, the rancher of Coyote Ridge, a man known across the frontier for his solitude, his rough hands, and his refusal to bend to corruption. And though he had no reason to stand for us, no ties to our names, he rode into town with fire in his eyes and his rifle gleaming beneath the sun, shouting for the crowd to back down, to see the truth for what it was. And as his horse reared and his shadow stretched long against the gallows, I felt the first flicker of hope, the first breath of life return to lungs already halfway resigned to death. Yet even as relief surged, I knew this was no rescue story, easily won, because the men in black coats, the ones with secrets worth killing for, were already drawing their guns, ready to silence the rancher just as they had tried to silence us. And in that tense heartbeat, the line between salvation and execution grew thinner than a strand of rope. Eli's voice cut through the chaos, declaring that he knew what they were hiding, that he had seen enough of their crates, their midnight dealings, and that if one more innocent man died, he would burn the truth across the whole territory until not even the governor could hide them. And though his words were daggers against the black-cloaked men, his stance was steady, his gaze unshaken. And I realized that this was the kind of man who didn't fight for himself but for what was right, the kind of man who carried justice in his blood like a curse and a blessing. The hangman hesitated, The sheriff faltered. The crowd shifted uneasily. And in that silence, stretched like eternity, Eli raised his rifle and fired. Not at us, not at the sheriff, but at the rope above our heads. The shot ringing like thunder, the fibers snapping, and suddenly we were falling, choking as the noose loosened, lungs gasping for air. Alive, alive, when we should have been corpses swinging in the wind. The crowd erupted, screams and shouts, mingling with gunfire, as the men in black turned their wrath on Eli, bullets flying, horses rearing, chaos unleashed like a storm. And though our bodies trembled with weakness, with the ache of ropes and fear, the spark of survival surged, and we scrambled to our feet, stumbling toward the rancher who had become our only chance, our unexpected savior. And as we ran, as dust and smoke swallowed the town square, I knew deep inside that we had not escaped yet, that this was only the beginning, because secrets like the one we carried did not die with broken ropes. They grew, they hunted, and they demanded blood, until the truth was buried forever or revealed to the world. And in that moment, as Eli shouted for us to mount up and ride with him, I made a vow in my heart. If fate had spared us from the gallows, it was not so we could run, but so we could fight. And whatever storm waited on the horizon, we would face it together. The desert stretched out before us like an endless graveyard. The horizon blurred with heat waves and shimmering illusions, and the air carried that dry, metallic taste that always reminded me of old blood and rust. A reminder that the frontier didn't care for men's dreams or prayers, only for their strength to survive another day. And on that particular evening, the wind came rolling low, whispering through the sagebrush and rattling the brittle bones of the land, as though the earth itself wanted to warn us to turn back. But by then it was already too late, for we had crossed the line that no man could return from once his eyes had seen what ours had, and that line would soon bring us to the gallows where the ropes hung ready like patient snakes waiting for our necks. We hadn't meant to find it, that secret, and to this day I curse the moment we strayed off the main trail looking for water and shelter, our throats parched, our horses weary, our bodies baked by the merciless sun, because if we had stayed to the road like wise men, perhaps our lives would have drifted along in anonymity, nothing more than dust on the wind. But fate has a cruel hand, and sometimes it drags men straight into the jaws of death. We stumbled upon Black Hollow just as the sun was bleeding itself across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, a beauty so fierce it almost made us forget our hunger. But the silence there was strange. A silence too heavy for a ranch that large, with its fences stretching far into the hills and its barn doors wide open like gaping mouths, yet not a soul in sight, no cattle lowing, no dogs barking, no voices calling, just emptiness wrapped around the place like a shroud. And still, we went closer, because a thirsty man ignores his instincts when water might be near. The ground was churned with tracks too many for one ranch, boot prints and horse hooves, and when we followed them past the barn to the far side of the corral, that's when we saw them, dark figures, half a dozen men, maybe more, digging deep pits in the fading light, their movements quick and nervous, their shovels striking not just dirt but something harder, metallic, hollow. And when they pried open the first crate, the gleam of iron spilled out like a serpent uncoiling. Rifles, ammunition, crates upon crates, marked not with ranch brands, but with military insignias scratched out and replaced with crude symbols. Smuggled weapons meant for something far more sinister than ranching. My heart froze in my chest, and I knew at once that whatever business these men were in, it was not meant for the light of day. And the moment our eyes fell upon their work, our lives ceased to belong to us. We tried to back away, silent as shadows, but the land betrayed us. A branch snapped beneath my boot, loud as a rifle crack, and the men's heads whipped around, their faces pale ghosts in the twilight, eyes hard and unyielding. And in a breath, they had guns drawn, voices barking curses, and before we could even think to run, we were dragged forward, shoved to the ground, the taste of dirt filling my mouth as they bound our wrists with coarse rope, tight enough to cut into flesh, their eyes burning with the certainty that we had seen too much. They spoke in low tones, arguing among themselves whether to kill us there in the dirt and bury us with their secret, or to make a show of it in town so no other fool would ever dare cross them. And in the end, fear of suspicion won. They decided on the gallows, a spectacle to teach the whole territory that silence was the only safe currency. And so they hauled us to our feet and marched us under the cover of darkness, our throats dry, our hearts pounding like war drums, knowing with each step that we were walking toward our own execution. Dust Creek was a small town, but mean in spirit, the kind of place where law bent like a weak fence under the weight of whoever paid the sheriff's wages. And when they dragged us through the main street, the townsfolk gathered, eyes wide with curiosity but empty of compassion. For hangings were not new to them, and two more strangers at the end of a rope would not shake their sleep that night. I remember the way the gallows looked in the moonlight, tall and skeletal, looming like a vulture waiting to feast, its beams weathered by years of death, the ropes swaying gently in the breeze as if already eager for our necks, and the sight of it sent a chill crawling down my spine, though sweat still poured down my face. They locked us in a holding shack till dawn, a cramped, foul place with one barred window and a dirt floor, and though my body ached from the ropes and the blows they had landed on us, it was my mind that suffered most, trapped in the knowledge that I would never again see the wide plains, never again feel the freedom of the saddle beneath me, because when the sun rose, so too would the nooses. My companion, God bless his stubborn soul, kept whispering that had to be a way, that maybe a miracle would come at the last moment. But I had seen enough of life to know miracles rarely found men like us, drifters without family or coin, men who could vanish and leave no mark on the world. And yet, as the first light of dawn crept into the shack, painting the dirt floor in pale gray, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm born not of acceptance but of a quiet, burning rage that this was how it would end, not by our sins, not by the justice of God, but by the greed of men and the weight of a secret we never asked to carry. When they dragged us out to the gallows, the crowd was already gathered, their faces hard as stone, some eager for the show, some indifferent, and a few, very few, looking on with pity, but none daring to speak against it. For the sheriff's men stood nearby, rifles ready, and the black-coated figures who had bound us lingered at the edge, their eyes glinting with satisfaction, their secret safe once we swung. The sheriff himself read out the charge, his voice loud and hollow, accusing us of theft, trespassing, and conspiracy, lies crafted from thin air, but given the weight of law by the badge on his chest, and the crowd accepted it without question. For in those days, truth was whatever the man with the badge declared it to be. They marched us up the steps, the creak of the wood loud in my ears, the nooses waiting like halos of death, and as the hangman slipped the rough rope over my head, the fibers scraping against my skin, I felt every heartbeat like the ticking of a clock counting down the last seconds of my life. And in those final moments, I thought of freedom, of wide skies and open trails, and wondered if that was where the soul rode after death. The sheriff raised his hand to give the signal, the crowd hushed, and I closed my eyes ready for the floor to drop, when suddenly a sound split the silence, thunderous voice rolling across the square, deep and commanding, a voice that carried the weight of justice and fury, and when I opened my eyes I saw him, Eli McGraw, the rancher of Coyote Ridge, a man I had heard of but never met, riding into the square atop a massive chestnut stallion, his broad frame straight as iron in the saddle, his rifle glinting in the morning sun, and his eyes burning with a fire that silenced even the hangman's hand. He shouted for them to stop, his words cutting through the air like a blade, calling the hanging what it truly was, a murder to cover up corruption, a killing to bury a secret that would damn every man who stood by and watched. The crowd shifted, uneasy murmurs rippling through them, for Eli was no ordinary rancher. He was a man known for his unyielding will, for fighting against land barons and corrupt sheriffs alike, a man whose word carried weight because he never bent to lies. The sheriff tried to bark him down, tried to wave his badge like a shield, but Eli's rifle spoke louder, one crack of thunder, and the bullet tore through the rope above my head, snapping it clean, sending me crashing to the platform, gasping for air, but alive, alive when I had already tasted death. The crowd erupted, chaos spilling across the square, some screaming, some running, the black-coated men drawing their guns to silence Eli, but he was quicker, firing again, driving them back, his stallion rearing with a scream that echoed like war, and in that madness I felt a surge of strength, dragging myself to my knees, meeting the eyes of the rancher who had saved me, and in that look I saw not mercy, not pity, but a call to fight, a demand that if he risked his life for ours, then we damn well better find the courage to live and face what was coming, because this was not the end, it was only the beginning. The sun had barely risen over the jagged hills when we mounted Eli's horses, dust rising around us like the spirits of the dead, our muscles stiff and aching, hearts still pounding from the chaos of the gallows, but there was no time to rest, no time to marvel at our miraculous survival, because the men we had angered were relentless, shadows stretching over the horizon like a swarm of locusts. And Eli kept his eyes sharp, scanning the tree line, his hands steady on the reins, his rifle never straying far, a reminder that our reprieve was fragile, temporary, and that every second we lingered was another second closer to death. We rode hard, following the narrow canyon trails that only Eli knew, the rocks cutting against the hooves, the wind burning our faces with grit. As we plunged deeper into the labyrinth of stone, I could feel the weight of the secret pressing against my mind, the knowledge that whatever was buried in Black Hollow wasn't just weapons or crates, but a plan that could destroy towns, kill innocents, and bring terror to the entire frontier. And we were the only witnesses, the only ones who could expose it if we survived. Every rustle of brush, every snap of a twig made our hearts jump, and Eli's gaze never wavered, scanning, listening, calculating, a living testament to the kind of man who had survived decades in a land that chewed up weaker men without hesitation. And I realized then that salvation was not always loud, not always obvious. It was the quiet, unshakable courage of someone willing to risk everything for strangers they had no reason to protect. Hours passed, the canyon twisting into shadows, the sun climbing higher, and yet the men in black were close behind, their horses pounding the dust like thunder, shouts echoing off the stone walls, a reminder that the frontier was merciless, and the noose had not been the end, merely an interlude, a warning that the moment of reckoning was coming. Eli didn't speak much, only issuing sharp instructions, guiding us through hidden paths, calling us to silence whenever the hunters' voices drifted too near, and in the rare quiet moments, he shared fragments of his past, tales of skirmishes with outlaws and corrupt officials, how he had built his ranch not just with sweat, but with the stubborn belief that justice mattered, even when the law didn't. And somehow, in the middle of fear and uncertainty, those stories became lifelines, threads of hope we clung to as the shadows behind us grew longer, darker, more menacing. By the time dusk approached, the canyon opened into a hidden valley, place Eli called Refuge Hollow, a natural fortress of cliffs and forest where no one could easily follow. And here he finally allowed us to breathe, to drink water, and to tend to our wounds, our bodies battered, our spirits raw, but our minds racing with the urgency of what we had to do next. For the men we had angered would not rest, and the deadly secret would not stay buried if we didn't act. Around the campfire that night, Eli finally revealed what he knew, how the crates in Black Hollow were just the beginning, part of a network of arms and mercenaries, how the men behind them were planning a coup, intending to seize control of the territories by fear and bloodshed, and how anyone who learned of it risked being silenced forever, just as we almost had been. And as he spoke, the firelight flickering over his lined face, I felt both fear and resolve, because survival was no longer enough. Justice demanded action, courage demanded confrontation, and the only way to stop the carnage was to strike at the heart of the conspiracy before it spread. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts, dreams haunted by shadows and the creak of rope. And when dawn broke, pale and fragile, we were already riding again, scouting, learning, planning, following Eli's lead through hidden passes, abandoned trails and forgotten settlements, gathering intelligence where we could, listening to rumors whispered in saloons, watching for patterns in the movements of the men in black. And each day the danger grew closer, the threat more tangible, until it was no longer a story whispered in fear but a reality stalking us across the plains, a predator that did not forget and would not forgive. We encountered others along the way, outlaws, wanderers, mercenaries, and even townsfolk who had their own grudges. But Eli's presence commanded respect, and often his calm authority turned potential threats into allies, if only for a moment, if only long enough to give us strength, food, and passage, because out here survival depended not just on skill but on knowing who to trust, and every decision carried the weight of life or death. At one point we came upon a river crossing where the men in black had set ambushes before, their rifles hidden in the tree, ready to pick off anyone foolish enough to appear. And Eli's mind worked faster than ours could comprehend, scanning for angles, calculating the wind, the sun, the slope of the banks, and with a single hand signal he guided us down a hidden ford, water rising to our knees, horses straining, and we passed under the noses of death itself without a shot fired, a silent triumph that left us breathless with relief and awe, because it was not luck that saved us, but skill honed over decades, a mastery of the land that only someone who had lived and survived every hardship of the frontier could possess. By the third day, we were approaching the outskirts of Black Hollow again, not to return to the gallows but to strike at the sword, to confront the men who had sought our deaths, and expose the secret that could kill hundreds if left unchecked. And though fear twisted in my stomach, the fire of resolve burned brighter, because we had been given a second chance, and second chances demanded action, not silence. We watched the ranch from hidden ridges, studying guard rotations, supply routes, the patterns of movement that revealed weakness, and when night fell we slipped inside under the cloak of darkness, moving silently like shadow, guided by Eli's steady hand, in the knowledge that discovery meant immediate death. And yet every step forward was fueled by a determination born from our near execution, a will to make the men pay for the lives they had so casually tried to take. Inside the main barn, we discovered more than crates of weapons, documents detailing alliances, shipments, plans for attacks, lists of names, places and dates, and as I held the papers in trembling hands, I realized that the secret was not just deadly, it was a map of terror, a blueprint for domination, and if left unchecked, it would doom everyone who stood in its path. We knew we had to escape with the evidence, but the men in black were not ignorant. They had patrols, traps, and scouts, and the slightest noise could alert them, so Eli devised a plan, meticulous and dangerous, requiring timing, precision, and absolute trust, and for the first time, I understood the weight he carried, not just as a man who had saved us once, but as someone who now risked everything to see justice done. The night stretched long, and as we moved through the shadows, hearts pounding, the smell of hay and oil thick in the barn, I thought of the gallows, of how close we had been to death, and how miraculous it was that we had survived, and yet survival alone was not enough, because the secret we carried demanded exposure, demanded courage, demanded that we confront not just our fear but the very men who had tried to hang us for it. And somewhere deep inside, I felt a transformation, a shift from victim to fighter, from powerless to determined, knowing that the only way to honor the second chance we had been given was to see it through to the end. We moved like shadows through the barn, careful not to knock over a single crate, each step deliberate, hearts hammering as the gravity of the moment pressed down on us, like the weight of the desert at noon, and every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the faint shuffle of feet, the whisper of our own breathing, and yet despite the fear clawing at my chest, a strange clarity settled over me, a focus born of desperation, the kind that sharpens the mind and steels the hands, for we knew that one misstep could cost us everything, and Eli's steady presence beside us was the anchor we clung to, his calm assurance a shield against panic, a reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. We split up for a moment, Eli moving toward the crates, stacked near the far wall, his movements precise, practiced as if he had done this countless times before, while my companion and I scoured the documents, rifle, and crates for any evidence that could expose the network of men whose influence stretched far beyond Dust Creek. And as I rifled through papers, my hands shaking, I realized the enormity of what we held, the way the secrets of murder, corruption, and betrayal were laid bare in ink and stamp. And in that instant survival felt almost secondary to duty, for the lives of countless innocents now depended on our courage and wit. Outside, shadows shifted as the men in black patrolled, and every instinct screamed that discovery was imminent, that a single whistle, a single cry could bring death crashing down upon us. But Eli's voice, low and commanding, cut through the tension, guiding our movements, giving instructions in whispered tones that carried authority, and I obeyed without hesitation, for in his eyes burned the certainty of a man who had faced death more times than I could count, and who now risked everything for strangers he barely knew. Hours passed, the night deepened, and when we finally had the crates, documents, and weapons secure, Eli signaled for us to move out through a side entrance, a narrow hidden door leading to the dense woods behind the barn, a route unknown to the patrols, and as we slipped through the shadows, the crunch of leaves under our boots sounding deafening, I felt the adrenaline surge, the mixture of fear and exhilaration that only comes when life hangs by a thread. We rode hard, the horses straining, the night swallowing us as we plunged into the thick forest, branches whipping against our faces, the scent of pine and dirt mingling with sweat and gunpowder. And though we knew pursuit was inevitable, Eli's knowledge of the terrain gave us a fighting chance, a hope that maybe, just maybe, we could reach a place where the evidence could be delivered safely, where justice could be served, and the lives of countless innocents spared. In the dim light of early morning, we reached a hidden glade, a place Eli called the Hollow, surrounded by towering cliffs and dense underbrush, where the men in black would be blind to our presence. And here, for the first time since the Gallows, we allowed ourselves a brief moment of relief, tending to the horses, checking our wounds, and preparing the documents for transport to the nearest authorities who could act against the conspiracy, though every one of us knew that the men we had angered would not sit idle. And this reprieve was fragile, temporary, and dependent on our speed and discretion. As dawn broke, pale and hesitant, Eli laid out a plan, his voice steady but urgent, detailing how we would move, who would carry which documents, and how to avoid the patrols that would surely be scouring the countryside. And as I listened, I felt a resolve hardening within me, the kind of resolve that comes only after staring into the eyes of death and being spared, a vow that we would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. For hours we navigated the forest, avoiding the main trails, slipping past streams and ridges, keeping low and silent, guided by Eli's expertise, and the faint glimmer of hope that perhaps we could succeed where so many others had failed. And as the sun climbed higher, we spotted smoke rising in the distance, a sign of civilization, but also a potential risk, for it could mean enemies or allies, and our tension mounted, every sound amplified, every movement deliberate. We skirted the settlement, moving along the tree line, hearts still pounding, adrenaline keeping our limbs strong despite exhaustion. And when we finally stopped to rest in a small clearing, Eli unrolled the documents, spreading them out with care, and we reviewed them, confirming that what we had stolen was enough to bring down the men in black, to unravel the conspiracy, and to ensure that justice could be served. But even as relief touched our hearts, we knew the hardest part remained. The journey to deliver the evidence would be fraught with danger, every mile a potential death trap, every wrong move a fatal mistake. Night fell again, and we rode under the cover of darkness, Eli leading with the confidence of a man who had survived every challenge the frontier had thrown at him, his instincts sharp, his eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. And I realized then that we were not just being guided by courage, but by wisdom, by experience, born of years, surviving in a land where only the strongest, smartest, and most daring could endure. And without Eli we would have been nothing more than corpses, swinging from ropes, forgotten and unremembered. By the second night, exhaustion gnawed at our body, and the constant threat of ambush pressed like a weight upon our shoulders. Yet we pressed on, the knowledge of what we carried propelling us forward. And in the rare moments of stillness, when the wind whispered through the trees and the horses breathing slow, we spoke in hushed tones about what we had almost lost, about the gallows, about the men who had tried to end our lives, and about the strange, undeniable fact that a man like Eli had chosen to risk everything for us. Strangers who had stumbled into his path. Somewhere along the trail, we encountered a trap, cleverly hidden in the brush, a rope stretched taut in a pit concealed beneath leaves, meant to maim or kill. And it was Eli's quick reflexes and sharp eyes that saved us once more, as he signaled in time for us to swerve, our horses lunging just past the deadly mechanism, hearts in throats, hands shaking from fear and relief. And as we continued, the gravity of every step became more apparent, for the enemy was relentless, intelligent, and cruel, and one mistake could undo everything we had survived. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we approached the settlement where we could deliver the evidence, a fortified town known for its loyalty to the law and disdain for corruption. And as we neared, Eli whispered for us to stay alert, for even here betrayal could lurk in the shadow. For men like those we were fleeing from did not hesitate to bribe, threaten, or kill, and the weight of the secret we carried pressed against our minds like an iron band, reminding us that our journey was far from over. As we entered the fortified settlement under the cover of night, the air was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to twist into a lurking threat, and yet the walls, high and imposing, offered the first true sense of security we had felt since the gallows, a fragile barrier between us and the relentless hunters we had escaped. Though Eli warned us to remain vigilant, for the enemy would not be far behind, and every step into the town was measured, silent, deliberate, each of us gripping our weapons tightly,
eyes scanning for any sign of betrayal. For we had learned the hard way that trust was a rare commodity, and vigilance was survival. Inside the town we were met by the marshal, a grizzled man with sharp eyes and a reputation for honesty in a land rife with lies, and Eli quickly laid out the situation, presenting the stolen documents and crates as evidence of the conspiracy, detailing the network of mercenaries, smuggled weapons, and plans for widespread terror. And though the marshal's jaw tightened at first, the gravity of the evidence soon overtook skepticism, and he nodded, signaling that justice would be pursued, that the men who had tried to hang us would face consequences, that the frontier would not bend to terror so long as there were men brave enough to fight for truth. Relief surged through me, a wave of warmth I hadn't felt in days, tempered immediately by the knowledge that the danger was not entirely gone, for the conspirators would not simply accept defeat. They were cunning, ruthless, and desperate, and the moment the authorities took action, they would retaliate. But with Eli and the marshal working together, and with the evidence we had risked everything to carry, the scales of power had shifted, and there was a real chance to end the threat before it spread further, to bring justice, not just for us, but for countless innocents who might have suffered if the secret had remained buried. That night, as the town slept under watchful guards and the wind rustled through the empty streets, we sat by the fire in the marshal's office, exhaustion pressing against our bodies like weights, yet a sense of triumph pulsing in our veins, for we had survived impossible odds, outwitted death itself, and delivered the truth into the hands of those who could act. And I realized that courage was more than facing fear, it was the choice to act, despite it, to risk everything for a greater good, and Eli had taught us that in ways no words could capture, a living example of heroism carved from the harshest soil. In the days that followed, the authorities moved swiftly, raiding the outposts, arresting the men in black, confiscating their weapons, and dismantling the networks that had sought to spread terror across the frontier. And while I watched from the sidelines, I felt the weight of gratitude and awe toward Eli, the rancher who had saved us not once, but countless times, who had turned a near execution into a journey of survival and justice, and whose courage became the catalyst for change in a land ruled by fear and corruption. Yet even amidst the triumph, I felt the lingering echo of danger, the knowledge that the frontier never truly forgives, never truly forgets, that the shadows always linger, waiting for the unwary. But with the secret exposed, with justice set in motion, we could finally breathe, if only for a moment, knowing that our lives, once almost ended by ignorance and cruelty, had become instruments of truth, proof that even in the darkest of places, courage and righteousness could prevail. Eli, ever humble, refused accolades, content to watch as the law took its course, as the conspirators were brought to justice, and in his quiet way, he reminded us that heroism was not about recognition, but about doing what was right, and I knew then that the frontier, for all its brutality and treachery, still had room for men of integrity, men who could stand against death and corruption with nothing but their principles and the strength of their will. When the final arrests were made, and the town celebrated a hard-won victory, we stood together outside the marshal's office, the wind carrying the scent of sage and earth, the horizon vast and open once more, and for the first time in days, I felt true freedom, the kind that comes not from escaping death, but from facing it and choosing to fight, to act, and to survive with purpose. And as Eli mounted his horse to ride back to Coyote Ridge, he turned to us with a rare smile, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in fire and danger. And though words were few, the message was clear. We had been spared for a reason, and the frontier, harsh and unyielding, still had men willing to stand for justice, and that knowledge was more valuable than gold. As we watched him disappear into the dawn-lit horizon, my companion and I exchanged a glance, hearts still heavy with the memory of the gallows, yet lifted by the triumph we had achieved together, knowing that the deadly secret, which had once promised only death, had instead forged survival, courage, and a chance to make the frontier a place where fear no longer ruled. And in that moment, I understood the true power of bravery, loyalty, and unwavering justice, a lesson etched into my soul, as permanent and unyielding as the desert itself, and I vowed that we would carry it forward, living as witnesses to truth, and as bearers of the story that even in the darkest of times, the right hand, steady and fearless, could turn near certain death into salvation. The journey back to normalcy was quiet, the horses moving steadily, the sun climbing higher, and though the horizon was wide, promising new paths, I felt the weight of all we had endured, the shadow of what might have been, and yet it was tempered by the knowledge that we had survived, that justice had prevailed, and that a single man's courage, the courage of Eli McGraw, the rancher who had refused to stand idle, had changed the course of fate, not just for us, but for the countless lives that would be saved because of the secret revealed. And as the days turned into weeks, the tale of our near execution, our miraculous rescue, and the exposure of a deadly conspiracy spread across the territories, whispered in saloons, recounted around campfire, and carried in the wind across the plains. And though we never sought fame, we came to understand that survival coupled with action could inspire, could awaken courage in others, and that the legacy of bravery, even when born from desperation, had the power to transform fear into hope, and darkness into light. And in that knowledge, I felt a sense of peace, a recognition that our story, once one of terror and near death, was now one of triumph, a testament to the power of courage, justice, and the unyielding will to survive.
And so, as we rode away from the town and the gallows that had once promised our end, the wind carrying our whispered gratitude to Eli, I knew that the frontier had tested us, threatened us, and nearly claimed us, but it had also given us a chance to stand, to fight, and to survive. And in that survival, we found purpose, courage, and a story worth telling. A story that would remind all who heard it that even in a land ruled by fear, a single man with a steady hand and an unbroken heart could change everything. And that sometimes salvation comes not from luck, but from the unwavering bravery of those willing to risk everything to see justice done. And with that thought etched deep in my heart, I turned to my companion and whispered, "We live because he believed in justice." And though our throats were still hoarse from fear and shouting, a smile broke across my face. A smile born not of relief alone, but of the knowledge that we had been given a second chance to walk freely under the open sky, to live with purpose, and to carry the story of courage forward so that others might find hope in the darkest of times.